Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everybody. Today, we are happy to have Conor as a speaker in this third talk of our seminar series. Conor did his undergraduate studies on computer science and pure mathematics, and then he obtained a master's degree in mathematics of cryptography and communications from the Royal Holloway University of London. Currently, he's a predoctoral researcher at Pompeu Fabra University, where he's doing research on new blockchain protocols in order to solve different open problems in this area, such as, for example, the security of transactions or the privacy of protocols. Today, he's going to talk about the limitations of existing state machine replication protocols, a common approach to implement fault-tolerant services. And he will also show us the solution they have developed to overcome some of those limitations. Before starting, I would like to remember that we have a Q&A chat where you can write your questions to the speaker, and he will try to answer them live. Otherwise, he will take a look at the end of this talk. So yeah, Conor, please, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Santos, and thanks everyone for attending. So I guess if I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, but if there's anything that you think is pressing, I guess just interrupt me, because again, I have two screens here. I might not see the chat bar. I think I should, but anyway. Okay, it's perfect. So the sort of the title of my talk today is state machine replication without honest participants. And I guess rather than try and explain everything at once, I'll sort of provide a little primer, some motivation. So I guess Santos mentioned that to sort of maybe to try and maybe gear the talk a little bit more towards cryptocurrencies and blockchain. And I guess it's not just Santos that's talking about this right now, it's everyone. And the words get bandied around a lot. So when you hear cryptocurrency and blockchain, I guess you can think of things like correct me if I'm wrong, the Burj Mohammed bin Rashid as cryptocurrency, and blockchain as the trust tower. And if that's the case, then state machine replication is the foundation on which they're built. It's the core protocol which allows us to sort of for cryptocurrencies to exist, and the reason why they're so successful right now. Okay, so again, building on the motivation, I always include this this sort of graph, and every time I include it, it gets a little bit. I have to extend the screen a little bit further, because cryptocurrencies aren't going down. The total market capitalization of cryptocurrencies has gone over $1.5 trillion. So we're a long way from basically everything that we believed when we created cryptocurrencies, or when Satoshi Nakamoto created cryptocurrencies. It has changed significantly, and we're basically the Bitcoin pizza sort of story about someone paying 10,000 Bitcoin for one pizza. We're a long way from that today, and that pizza is now worth $500 million. So basically, the long and short of what I'm saying is everything that we believed 10 years ago has basically has to basically evolve to meet the sort of the massive amounts of money that we're talking about right now. So basically, all of these protocols, these SMR protocols, which underpin the security of cryptocurrencies, require and expect honest players like a Vulcan. So we need an honest majority, or at least one honest player, depending on what the protocol that we're looking at. But this is now in the face of, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these massive market capitalizations. And we've seen that when we have free markets and people can make money, we actually get people like this who are trying to do anything by hook or by crook to make some money. And in a free market, it's pretty hard to sort of depend on these honest players. And basically, this comes to a fore because with the sort of the attack that has been identified called selfish mining. So, assuming we have honest players, Ayal and Serrer showed that it was actually possible to increase the amount of Bitcoin that you earn by deviating from the protocol. And by deviating from a protocol, everything the protocol guarantees can no longer be guaranteed. So we have this attack, or not necessarily an attack, but a strategy that players can take to increase the amount of Bitcoin they own. But I guess immediately, if you look at the amount of blocks that have been orphaned, which is a popular indicator of how many people are selfish mining, there hasn't really been any selfish mining for, it looks like, for possibly 4 years. So why don't people selfish mine? So considering that people can selfish mine to increase the rewards, why don't they do it? Well, the argument is that we're in a sort of prisoner's dilemma, where if everybody were to do this strategy, the system would fail. And again, it's a pretty strong argument because the people who are investing in these currencies, they've obviously bought, in the case of Bitcoin, they bought a lot of hashing power, or in proof of stake currencies, they own a lot of the currency that they're investing in. So to deviate would reduce the sort of the legitimacy of the coin. So they might lose value, the coin might lose value, and that might make their attack or their strategy irrelevant. But I guess one example that I always like to think about is this connectivity, and it's mentioned in the selfish mining paper. If you are connected to the network, you get to see what everyone else does first. And in the original paper, in this selfish mining paper, the authors prove that if you get to see all the messages before everyone else, and your messages will, if you then send a message and it gets received first, you will you will increase the amount of Bitcoin you earn no matter how much hashing power you own. And we've seen in stock markets where there's maybe millions of dollars at stake that people do this. People go through mountains, people lay underwater cables to increase the amount of money they earn, these fractional seconds. And we know that people like big tech, for example, have these ability to maybe implement something like that. Okay, Q&A. Chat. Sorry, I guess Amanda wrote in the chat, but Hector was saying something. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that it might have been a mistake. So we can
sure.
Conor. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess I know I might get a bit of a head of steam up as well. So if you get hand up, is absolutely fine. Just to sort of maybe backtrack and keep up with what's going on. Okay, perfect. So where was I? So yeah, people have the ability to implement this high connectivity, and there's also other people in the game, people who might have the ability to attack the system, or not attack the system, but implement this selfish strategy, who might not necessarily care about the devaluation of the entire currency, because the devaluation of one cryptocurrency might increase the value of another cryptocurrency as people switch across. And that applies not only to cryptocurrency owners, but also maybe to people who have an interest in, for example, centralizing so obviously these cryptocurrencies came in to decentralize money exchange, but people who might want to re-centralize might also be impartial or not really care about the devaluation of the currency. So basically what we have here is a game where the pot size is in the trillions of dollars now, where we're assuming players act honestly, and if they don't act honestly, the protocols don't work. And in basically all of the protocols, we have strategies where you can increase the amount of coins that you own. Now, again, maybe right now, these sort of prisoner's dilemma that I sort of mentioned earlier, that might be effective. But what happens if this goes to 10 trillion, to 100 trillion? If Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency is our reference token and we can't escape, well, basically, we'll be trapped in the system where we have these big players who can increase the amount of coins they own. They can break the protocols, and there's nothing we can do about it. So I guess when you think about why everyone is still doing this, I guess maybe people are oblivious to it, but also it's actually a little bit hard to analyze this stuff. So I guess this maybe is a sort of a Joso blockchain protocol designer who is asked why they're still depending on honest players. Okay, so hopefully maybe people are a little bit motivated. Okay, this guy is saying that everything is broken, we need to fix it. But I guess that was just sort of maybe, all this stuff is true, but I guess it's just to get your attention. Now I want to sort of talk about the goals of the presentation. because I guess the backgrounds of everyone here are a little bit varied. So I guess there's a couple of goals that I want to sort of talk about. So state machine replication. I've mentioned that it underpins blockchain and cryptocurrency, but I want to sort of maybe dive a little bit deeper into it just so people have a flavor of what it is. So definition, use cases, and its importance. Then player characterizations. So I mentioned in the slide, at least, with the Vulcan versus Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street. There's two different possible types of players. There's obviously these honest players that people depend on, which are the current standards, and then there's the new standards, or at least as we increase the amount of money that's at stake, we can no longer assume pessimistically. We then need to assume players will try and maximize the amount of rewards they make. And then in this distributed systems, we always also have to include these deviating players, or the Byzantine players. But I'll go into the model a little bit later. But I guess as a goal, I want to sort of maybe expand on some of these standards, old and new, that we're describing. And again, this new standard is what we're sort of pushing in the paper that we've recently published. And then so obviously in this new model, all of the current proof methods for guaranteeing SMR protocols, these protocols that underpin cryptocurrencies, none of these proofs make sense anymore, because they all depend on these honest honest players that we argue we can no longer depend on. And obviously, these formal guarantees are mathematical proofs, but then we take those proofs, and because obviously, like, a big question is, okay, this all sounds very nice, but can it actually be implemented in practice? So we then show how to construct a protocol that achieves SMR in this ByRa model, and how we can maybe extend the results that we've shown for our protocol, how it can be extended to protocols maybe like that are being used in cryptocurrencies right now. Okay, so baby steps, state machine, just in case some people are unfamiliar. We have a set of variables or a set of states, and we have actions on those variables. And based on the actions and our starting variables, we can then track which state we are in the system. So the simple example is of a lock. But a more interesting example might be tracking balances between friends, where you're trying to send each other money. And in this case, there's one person in charge. Looks like someone keeps track of all the money. So whenever you want to send money to another friend, you have to ask that person, do I have the money to send? They have to verify that you have the money, all that sort of financial transaction jargon. So again, but a general ledger cannot be described by a simple state machine like we have on the left, but it's a state machine nonetheless. So then state machine replication. So in the previous slide, we had this general ledger controlled by one person. Well, if many people want to control it, so that you no longer depend on just one person, in case that person might get corrupted or they might crash. So what happens to the system if they crash? So you want many players to have a copy of the system. And to do that, you need state machine replication. So state machine replication then allows each of these friends, so given they have this, not necessarily friends, but let's say these guys are friends, to agree on the actions given as some common set of starting variables, how the system progresses. Like we all agree that X sent money to Y, and then Y received money from Z, and we're able to agree on how those actions take place. So when we have the set of variables and the ordering of these actions, we then get a state machine that's replicated among many players. And then this becomes even more interesting when we add a few possible deviating players into the system, players whose sort of goal is not necessarily aligned with making sure everybody agrees in the system. In fact, their goal might be the opposite. Their goal might be to ensure that people disagree on what the state machine what state the state machine is in. So towards describing how we achieve state machine replication, I just want to sort of go over the sort of basic example in this field, which is the Byzantine generals problem. And the problem is based on it's based on a paper by the same name by Lamport, and it's the game, or the scenario is there's many players, many generals, one king who is deciding on the action, and all generals have to agree on what to do. But in the system, there is some subset of players who are deviators and are traders and want to sort of disobey the king. So the Byzantine general problem begs the question: how is it possible that all players in the system can agree on what the king says when the only communications are through messengers and no signatures? So we can't authenticate who's sending what and what state everyone else is in. Well, in the same paper, Lamport showed that if f is less than n/3, so this 1/3 bound, which is still used today, is that yes, we can actually guarantee that there's a protocol that all of the honest players honest generals can follow, that they will all be able to agree on what the king says, and that's called that problem solves the Byzantine agreement, and then that was extended by Dork et al., both very famous papers, where we can actually improve that bound in this sort of where we're trying to agree on one message, that the bound is actually increased to f less than n/2. So this problem solves if we're trying to agree on one specific action. But state machine application protocols, we actually have to agree on potentially infinite set of values. So what do we require in addition to what we had with the consensus protocol? We require safety, so that if two players decide on a value, the values would be the same at each position in the sequence, which is sort of makes sense. And then liveness, that every player eventually decides on every value. A value for every position. So safety means that everybody agrees on not only every action, but the order of the actions. And then liveness guarantees that the system will continue to progress. So in terms of SMR solutions, so the famous sort of early examples are Paxos by Lamport. So Lamport hung around this Byzantine general's problem and then transformed it into a SMR solution. And PBFT, which forms the basis for a ton of the cryptocurrencies that we have today. But those protocols are a little bit tough, and then advancements basically have been to simplify the solutions. And one of the big drawbacks of these protocols is that before you start the protocol, you need to know the number of participants that are playing. Now again, it doesn't really affect us that much, or at least the problem isn't that major for people who are sort of coming at the problem cold. And as I said, in its exact sort of like maybe with a couple of different bells and whistles, those PBFT and Paxos protocols where we require the knowledge of the number of participants, they're still being used today in these very, very large cryptocurrencies. But the cryptocurrency sort of space exploded once we got Nakamoto consensus. Nakamoto consensus basically allowed us to create permissionless consensus. So we no longer needed to know who was going to be playing in advance, which sort of, once we had the internet, we had this sort of free joining principles in these like agreement protocols. Permissionless consensus was a massive revelation. And it was done, or at least the theory behind it was basically that the hashing power in the world is capped. So to play the system, you had to commit to this sort of solving this puzzle. That meant that an adversary or someone who was trying to mess with the system couldn't just create, or at least couldn't replicate lots of nodes, which is known as a Sybil attack. It also introduced this concept of probabilistic consensus, and the blockchain that we're sort of blockchain idea that we're familiar with now today is based on this Nakamoto consensus and was conceived there. So basically, every block you have to solve this puzzle to add a set of actions, which are the sort of SMR actions that we described earlier on, like contains like a set of send money to X, receive money from Y. And to add those updates, you have to solve a puzzle. And the SMR, how you actually construct the ledger after the fact, is by going through the longest chain, because you know that people have to spend some money, in advance, this hashing power. And eventually, if enough people point to your chain, which is the rule for adding to the chain, you can be sure after a certain number of blocks that that block is going to be part of the permanent ledger, and you can then apply your SMR rule to the blockchain. And I guess that was just sort of a quick sort of tour through the blockchain, or sorry, not the blockchain, but the SMR, what we're using it for, and how it came to fruition. And I guess if you're interested, those are sort of the key steps, at least for if you're trying to understand it, and how it was developed. Okay, so yeah, in terms of the goals of the presentation, hopefully state machine replication is a little clearer. And now for the rest of the parts, we're going to sort of talk about them through the paper that, or at least based on the paper that we just came up with recently, which is called Achieving State Machine Replication Without Honesty Assumptions, by myself, Vanessa Daza, and Matteo Pontecorvi. So the setting, it's sort of we tried to generalize the sort of the crypto, not necessarily the cryptocurrency, but the SMR setting, where there's n players owning a finite resource, which sort of generalizes both hashing power and stake. But again, it's helpful to think about stake as just currency. So the system proceeds in rounds, just so we have, as a protocol designer, we have some concept of time, and the players within the system believe that time is progressing. And then rational utility. So we have, I guess we have this system where we have these players. I guess rational utility will become a little bit clearer in a second, but we're trying to assume that all players who aren't Byzantine or who aren't deviating are going to be motivated by some function, and this function is the utility, and this utility will be measured in total stake. So I guess some more motivation, I guess, just replicating the slide from earlier on. You've obviously got this massive market capitalization of cryptocurrencies, but we can no longer assume honest players. So this problem was originally considered for MPC in a paper called Byzantine Players in a Virus Inoculation Game. So it's MPC setting. It's one action. So all the players in the system are trying to do one action. And the authors, so this paper was by Vattenhofer et al., and they were the first people to consider no honest players, which I guess was sort of a key, or like a sort of very important move away from standard MPC, where there's honesty assumptions. There was no honesty assumptions in this paper. And to guarantee the output of the system, we need this thing called a Byzantine Nash equilibrium, which basically states that all the rational players, so I guess just to be clear, Byzantine players deviate arbitrarily or try and break the system. So then given that, we require this Byzantine Nash equilibrium, which states that rational players believe that following the protocol is at least, it's one of the best strategies. And given that, you get this balance that no matter what the Byzantine players do, the rational players will always follow the protocol, and we're able to guarantee the output of the system. Which again, it's a nice paper and a lovely result. But as I mentioned, it was for one shot. It was for an MPC protocol. But can we apply it to SMR? And the answer is nearly. It does a lot of the good work for us, but obviously with SMR, it's over possibly infinite values. So we need to change sort of some of the assumptions and some of the approaches that were used in that paper by Vattenhofer et al. So again, possibly infinite rounds. So, and as protocol designers, the key part here is that we must consider the absolute rewards. So we have rational players who want to maximize the rewards, but we also have to consider how these rewards are paid out and what happens when they're paid out. So if your voting power is based on your stake, which is the case in many protocols, if some players get early advantages, then those players will benefit from those advantages, or at least in most protocols that exist today, for the rest of the game. So ensuring the distribution of control stays within the hands of people who will follow the protocol is a key concern, and something that's not considered in MPC, the MPC setting, because you only need to follow the protocol once. Okay, and then so basically what we need. So we have this Byzantine Nash equilibrium. We agree that is important, but we need to add a little bit of something else. And that little something is strict maximization and fairness. So I guess strict maximization, the reason I include that is because if we don't have strict maximization, and the example I like to use is a game where we require some player to always pick heads. if heads and tails has the same payout, because we can no longer, and if we require that all the players will choose heads, we need to actually, as protocol designers, make heads slightly more attractive for those players to ensure they will always choose it, rather than this warm fuzzy assumption that all players like to do the right thing, because in this free market, in this system, we need to be able to punish, or not punish, but at least incentivize players to do the right thing. And fairness. So this fairness is related to distribution of control over time, to ensure that this adversary in the system, or the bad players, can't grow, or at least that we can control their growth. So I guess obviously I've been talking about the motivation as like, here's all the problems. And then I guess one of the other motivators is the current solutions. So the best of the rest. So what people are currently doing. So the best paper, I think, in this field so far is Blockchains Cannot Rely on Honesty by Slavinsky and Vattenhofer. Very recent paper. And obviously I mentioned Vattenhofer again. Vattenhofer has got his finger in a lot of pies in the blockchain distributed system space. And it's not surprising that he's publishing something like this. But even in this paper, they omit some key strategies from possible strategies from rational players that rational players can follow in certain scenarios to actually maximize the rewards, which are not the protocol strategy, which is something that as protocol designers, we can't allow for. And fruit chains, I guess, is almost like, the Bible on this stuff, on fairness and incentive compatibility. But it's based on, its assumptions are based on this honest majority, which from all, I don't want to harp on, but sorry, I actually do want to harp on. We can no longer rely on honest players, and all of their proofs are based on this honest majority. And then Fair Ledger, again, Passan, Shai, and Malky, they're all big names. But if you and Fair Ledger looks and smells like a strong incentive compatible and fair protocol. But if you peel back the layers, and the layers are numerous, you will find at the very bottom of the protocol, in the same way that some MPC protocols can do it as well, that you need at some point one honest player. Once there's one honest player who will ignore all the possible reward increases for deviating, that will always follow the protocol, you're able to actually get out of jail free with this protocol that they construct. So all of these protocols, basically, as a summary, rely on the irrationality of rational players, which is a total contradiction of what we need to be able to do. Just to summarize them. So players in games try to maximize rewards. That's just the nature of games. SMR protocols are particularly lucrative games, $1.8 trillion up for grabs. And if you can slightly increase your profitability, you're definitely going to do it, or at least eventually you will do it if you think you'll get away with it. And as a result, we can no longer assume players will not act selfishly, which is currently the assumption that's being used across the board. So our contributions, Q&A again. Sorry, I've skipped on. Have I missed it? No, it's just finesse. Is it? Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll keep going. So our contributions. So we proposed the ByRa model for SMR. So as I mentioned, the ByRa model was considered for MPC within Vattenhofer's paper, but we propose it for use in SMR, and we propose it, and as I mentioned, Slavinsky and Vattenhofer, they also attempt to use it in their paper, but we propose it and stick to it. We ensure that every rational player has to be always maximizing their rewards by following the protocol. We then define these two properties, which I'll define properly in a second, of strong incentive compatible and expectation and fairness. And with those two properties, we then prove they are necessary and together sufficient for ByRa SMR. So it's a pretty big step. So I guess by getting your checklist out, checking for strong incentive compatible and expectation, checking for fairness, and again, with sort of, as mathematicians will often say, it's very easy to disprove the existence of something, and proving the existence is a little bit hard, and we definitely agree. But it allows people to come along based on our proofs for ByRa SMR, showing that like this is what you need for SMR. You can then easily check, or not easily check, but we create methodologies for checking the fairness, for checking the strong incentive compatible and expectation of protocols, which make it much more accessible, much easier for non-experts to sort of verify the protocols they're using are safe. And then sort of, we've obviously, all those results are mathematical and possibly theoretical. We then actually provide this protocol FAIRSICAL, which satisfies these properties. Okay, so ByRa model, just to sort of recap, but sort of maybe implicit from what I've been saying so far, but just to sort of say it definitively. So we have these Byzantine and rational players. Byzantine players can deviate arbitrarily and are controlled by this sort of all-seeing, all-knowing adversary, well, depending on your threat model. But these deviating players, and then any player who isn't Byzantine is rational. So again, they seek to maximize their non-utility function. And they're non-cooperative. I guess that's just a sort of a caveat. Rational players, we have to basically assume at some point that there's a limit to the size of players. And in our models, we assume that they're non-cooperative, that they can only communicate within the protocol. And just sort of include this point. So for some people who may be familiar with MPC or SMR, there is this bar model, which is sort of the standard, but it's, this BAR is just Byzantine, altruistic, and rational. So we're taking that bar model, which basically just says there's 3 types of players. We don't know how many of each there is. We're just saying we're getting rid of the altruistic, which is this honest by default player, which is the pessimistic case of the bar model. And it's, again, based on all the stuff that I've talked about so far, it's something that we have to prepare for, given the money at stake. Okay, so this is a sort of a slide that I've included earlier on, but just to recap, what do we want from an SMR protocol? So the safety property and the liveness property, that we agree on every position and the order of the positioning, and that we always progress. But then when we take it to the ByRa model, this new model that we're suggesting, we require that rational players control a sufficiently large share of stake and follow the protocol in every round. So there's a few subtleties there. I guess this is sort of related to the fairness property that I mentioned earlier on. So at the start of the system, like in MPC protocols, you have this initial bound on the size of the adversary, 1/3, 1/2, whatever it is, n-1. And then the protocol itself must guarantee that adversary can't grow later on in the system, which is something that, based on this selfish mining protocol, these sort of selfish mining attacks, these strategies which maximize your rewards, these strategies exist. And if an adversary can gain a small advantage early, they can sort of basically take that advantage for the rest of the system. So just to sort of clarify, we need rational players to follow the protocol, and for the rational players to also maintain their share of control in the system, or at least bound the adversarial control in the system. So I guess a little bit of mathematical notation, just because I've mentioned the word utility, and with respect to protocols like this, where rational players or players in the system have to choose their actions based on assumptions about other players, we have to include this expected utility. So a player's expected utility is their expected stake at a particular round. So I guess your utility with respect to a round is your expected stake at that round, given your current knowledge of the system, of what's going on in the system, and the particular strategy that you choose. So as I mentioned, we have these 2 properties: strong incentive compatibility and expectation. First of all, so given this definition of expected utility, we require that for every possible round, a player will maximize that function by including the strategy that's recommended by the protocol. And we emphasize strictly maximize. So again, it seems like a very, very strict property, very possibly unachievable, but at least in terms of mathematical proof, guaranteeing that rational players will always follow the protocol, we require strong incentive compatible and expectation. And then fair. So again, I've sort of mentioned it already, but I guess what the definition we're working with. So for any adversary starting the system with share S to the A1, we require that at any round in the system, their share is bounded by their initial share, with probability negligible in some security parameter, which I guess is a standard cryptographic notation. So these are the two properties: strong set of compatible and expectation, and fairness, that we are working with, that we sort of established as important. But I guess in terms of what the results that we achieved, here are the main results. So I guess maybe I probably should have included them one by one, but the first two lemmas prove that strong set of compatible and expectation and fairness are necessary for achieving SMR in the ByRa model. So when I say fail, I mean fails to achieve SMR. And then using the fact that they're both necessary properties, we then prove the theorem, the main theorem of the first section of the paper, which is sort of to show that we need these properties, is to show that strong set of compatible and expectation and fairness are necessary and together sufficient. Which is pretty, again, as sort of a, don't want to blow my own trumpet, I guess, but it's like mathematically proven that we can, once we have these two properties, and only if we have these two properties, we are able to achieve SMR, given players are Byzantine or rational. And then I guess the first part of our paper is very technical. But again, we build it up, so I guess it's technical, but it's there's a path to it. But the results are theoretical. So we then, in the second part of the paper, provide this FAIRSICAL protocol, which we've had some people sort of question this statement before, but we believe that it is the first protocol to achieve ByRa SMR. So the first protocol that's able to achieve this strong incentive compatible and expectation and fairness. I guess that's like there's some problem about black swans in history, where if you've only seen white swans, you can't predict that there will be a black swan. But we've gone through all the top protocols, all the ones that are like top 100, let's say, in the market capitalization, all the most referenced protocols in the literature, and to this date, we still haven't found one that's strong as compatible and fair in the ByRa model. So I guess another caveat of our protocol is that we introduced this broadcast functionality, which is in distributed systems. For people who are familiar, this threat model is a little bit unrealistic. But the focus of our paper was not necessarily to provide the end goal. Our motivation, or at least our goal, was much the same as the motivation today. Show people that we can no longer assume players will be rational. Prove why that's the case. Prove that there's certain properties that we can use to achieve SMR in this new model. And then we provide a protocol which is able to achieve it. And now, specifically, we're able to prove the protocol achieves these properties. So our key part of what we're trying to emphasize in the paper by providing this protocol is that it exists. And here are the techniques that you use to show that you have strong incentive compatible and expectation and fairness. So I guess this is sort of I included this diagram because it's I guess it's another example of a state machine, but this is a state machine for consensus, and this is the way that players in this SMR protocol, in the FAIRSICAL protocol, progress through the system. And I guess this might be a little bit too much to take in right now, but this is all available on a Medium page related to the paper that I can share with Santos if people are interested. So I guess it's just a standard consensus protocol. And maybe it's of independent interest for people who don't know much about SMR protocols. But every round, there's a propose round, validate, commit, and decide, which is standard in the Tendermint style protocols or PBFT protocols. And it's, again, we just use that exactly there. And based on our broadcast functionality and our threat model, we're able to get the properties we desire. But I guess one of the key parts of the protocol that we introduce is the reward mechanism. And we're in the reward, with the reward mechanism we choose, basically it guarantees that no matter what a player does for agreeing on a block, your reward is constant. So some proof of stake protocols, your reward is proportional to the share of stake that you own in the system. So you have some incentive to reduce other players' stake, to remove them from the protocol. In our protocol, FAIRSICAL, first of all, we proved that that's not the case in ours, that the protocol is, the reward per decision is independent of the share you own, or the share you own at a later stage. It's always the same as your first reward. And then using that very important fact, the important lemma, which I will sort of talk about in a second in more detail, is that we're able to prove these properties, this strong incentive compatible and expectation and fairness, which then, based on our previous theorem, means that FAIRSICAL achieves ByRa SMR. Now, all of these proofs are contained in the paper, if anybody's interested, but they're more of sort of algorithmic techniques rather than anything particularly tough. And then future work. So I guess I emphasized the reward mechanism earlier because the reward mechanism is pretty unique. We enforce constant rewards. So basically what that means is that because your reward is always equal to your starting share, or sorry, a constant times your starting share, there's no way that you can benefit from increasing your share. So that helps us to achieve strong incentive compatible and expectation. For example, some reward mechanisms related to Tendermint, that is the case, that increasing your share increases your reward later on the protocol. So removing that helps us to get towards strong incentive compatible and expectation. But it also guarantees fairness. It guarantees that the adversary can't increase their protocol. Sorry, if everyone follows, sorry, I guess the caveat is if everyone follows the protocol, their adversary can't increase their share of rewards and thus their total share in the system, which is we're able to use that to leverage our proof to show that FAIRSICAL is fair and achieves SMR. Another fact that we use is players can't send invalid messages in our protocol. So some protocols don't punish this, and in BFT consensus, sending invalid messages is one of the main ways that the adversary is able to sort of partition or at least break up some rational players and possibly punish them in the system, reducing their share of rewards and thus increasing the adversary share of rewards. Because again, thinking back maybe to some of the earlier slides, if we have this adversary who controls the network, which is a standard assumption, they can create a different view of the world for honest players. So forcing, or like, not when I say honest, I mean in this case, sorry, non-Byzantine, but by forcing players to send only valid messages, we remove a sort of a big attack vector of Byzantine players, which is something that not many papers do. And then based on those two previous points, because the reward is constant and you only get rewards by deciding on values, you then have this incentive to increase the speed at which you agree on blocks, so or agree on values or SMR updates. So you can't send invalid messages. Sending some sort of message increases your throughput, and there's a constant reward. There are three pretty basic properties, but they allow us to do pretty strong things. So currently, this sort of goes beyond what we're currently doing, or what we've published. We're looking at Tendermint, and this is the sort of state machine, sort of a much simpler state machine than I sort of created for FAIRSICAL. But everything in this graph, to these transitions. So I guess if by doing a full circuit of this, if you go from propose to pre-vote to pre-commit to commit back to propose via new height, you decide on a value and you get a reward. By making these transitions sort of, for want of a better word, by creating a lock on these transitions, where the only way you can get through a lock is by creating a proof of the event that allowed you to get through, which these proofs can be done cryptographically. Everything except the timeouts are provable, and because time doesn't really exist, or at least it's tough to exist in a partially synchronous network. So by creating these locks, we're able to actually enforce a lot of the sort of nice things that we were able to get for free in FAIRSICAL. And then with some small argumentation about the timeouts, why rational players would stick to a timeout, we're able to basically get to a Tendermint protocol that is, or a Tendermint reward mechanism that is now strong incentive compatible in expectation and fair. And I guess that sort of is just one protocol that we choose because Tendermint is sort of always seen as like a nice textbook protocol. But we believe that those techniques that we mentioned earlier, these constant reward, players can't send invalid messages, and sending messages, they're going to be key components in the future when people are trying to create protocols. And it's something that we sort of believe is, and it's the sort of goal of our future research is to sort of maybe formalize these a bit more and how they can be applied and how you can check for maybe what they achieve and what things that don't do these things sort of fail at. Okay, so I guess this, for people who might not have had background in SMR beforehand, sort of that second part with the paper might have been a little bit technical, but I guess I just want to go back over the sort of promises that I made at the start of or at least the goals that I thought would be useful for a seminar group. So at a high level, we went through what state machine replication was. That was sort of started off with Byzantine consensus and then moved from that to this PBFT Paxos, where we want to agree on many values which act on, for example, a ledger, but they can agree on storage, whatever you use SMR protocols for. And then from there, we went to player characterizations. And sort of throughout the paper, why we can no longer assume honest players will exist in these sort of SMR, highly monetized SMR protocols, and that we need to move to models that do no longer depend on those. And then in that system, that new model, how we can formally guarantee SMR in the ByRa model, and we prove that that's possible by ensuring the properties of strongest set of compatible and expectation and fairness, that they are necessary and together sufficient for SMR. And then ByRa SMR in practice, how we were able to create a protocol, albeit a sandbox protocol, that satisfies those properties. And then, as I mentioned with the Tendermint stuff at the end there, how we can extract some of those sort of basic techniques to existing protocols, and how the results are optimistic. So I guess that's the end of the talk. And I know it's a seminar, so if people have questions, or if people questions, they're more than welcome to take them there.
Thanks a lot, Conor. It was a very interesting talk. I really enjoy it. I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't know if Mark has any question for you.
No, just, I mean, thank you very much, Conor. From my side, it was really cool. I'd like, maybe, could you clarify a bit better what are the next steps that you have for what you've presented today? I think that I didn't get them in detail.
Sure. So I guess this sort of slide in the next slide, is that right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I guess in terms of, I guess, so one of the goals I sort of hoped that we sort of maybe discuss was where do we go from here? And I guess our end goal is to sort of make a general framework for constructing protocols that are strong incentive compatible and fair, or not necessarily strong incentive compatible and fair, but that achieve ByRa SMR. And maybe as these those sort of properties might develop into other properties that might be a little bit like sub-properties that might be a little bit easier to independently verify. But a first step towards doing that is to, I guess, move away from a sandbox protocol like FAIRSICAL, which depends on which depends on strict synchronization assumptions, into protocols that no longer depend on that are partially synchronous. And to do that, we basically trying to extract some of the nice properties that we have in FAIRSICAL. And so I guess it's a bit of a trial and error thing, but from my experience and from what I've sort of been looking at right now, if you can ensure these properties, these three properties, and those properties are pretty easy to implement, or at least in theory, because there's a lot of pressure to make these protocols streamlined. So creating cryptographic proofs for every transition can be seen as a massive congestion. But I guess extracting these with these three properties, this constant reward, players can't send invalid messages, and sending messages maximizes throughput. There's not many actions left from a rational player that will that they can deviate from, basically from a protocol strategy. And with that, so applying these new sort of like what I considered maybe general techniques to existing protocols, for example, like Tendermint, it'll make proving that we can actually achieve ByRa SMR in a partially synchronous network possible, and something that hopefully we can apply to other protocols.
Okay. Okay, clear.
Hopefully, I guess it's sort of like it's one of these things that, as I mentioned, not many people are looking at. So it's definitely, it feels like a little bit Magellan in a sense that you're trying to go to places that no one's gone before, and the problems that we're running into are sort of new. But with these three properties, the only, as I mentioned with the Tendermint protocol, for example, the only small properties that we need to keep an eye on are these timeouts. And then if we assume that rational players can't take timeouts, or sorry, they refuse to take timeouts, they will never receive messages in any partially synchronous network. And if they take infinite timeouts, it's possible for an adversary to stall the protocol. So now we have a scenario where rational players will take some timeout, and then the sort of tweaks that we need to apply to make sure that they increase them in line with the Tendermint protocol, they're pretty small. And I guess what we're trying to do right now is just formalize the problem is the code sort of can get pretty big pretty fast. So making it readable and making it presentable is the next step for us. But we're pretty optimistic about where we are with this.
Okay, that's clear.
Cool.
Yeah, congratulations. I really like the way you explained this. It was very, very, very interesting. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Okay, yeah. So if there are no more open questions, I think we can conclude the seminar here. I would like to thank you again for having prepared this excellent talk for us. I think everybody enjoyed the talk a lot. So yeah, thanks a lot, Conor.